So full disclosure, I left my iPad at the office last night, and so it was almost dead. So it's been charging, and so my notes are always on my iPad. They're just like a little note, like right there. But it doesn't have a lot of battery life. So if it dies, then we're done. You know what I'm saying? Like that's it. If it's done, then I can pretend like, you know what, I memorized this whole thing, which I mostly memorized all of it. But towards the end, there's a couple specific things we want to say, so who knows what's going to happen. The screen might do one thing, and when we get off, you'll know the iPad's dead. In fact, you'll see me, I'll just close it up in frustration because I forgot to go get it last night. So that's full disclosure, just letting you know how flawed this thing really is up here, okay? Just giving you a heads up. Hey, we're in week 3 of our Grit series, right? We've been in the book of Daniel and just kind of coasting through the book of Daniel just over the last few weeks. And so if you're new with us, it's okay. I want to catch you up briefly, and then we're going to dive in to this next little piece here. There's a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. He's a king in this book of Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar has had this really long life. And so we kind of went from chapter 3, where this really famous Sunday school story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the blazing furnace, and there's this huge statue of gold 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and ultimately the Nebuchadnezzar came to them and said, hey, here's the deal. I made this statue. I want you to bow down when the music plays. Music plays, face hits the floor. And so eventually they went back and forth, and they're like, hey, we're not doing that because we have given ourselves to God, and God specifically told us, thou shalt not do what you told us to do. And so we're not going to do that. So they're having this conversation back and forth. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind, throws them in the furnace, and it's there, once they're in the furnace, that Nebuchadnezzar looks and says, hey, I thought there was 3. Didn't we just throw 3 in the furnace? And they're like, yeah. He said, well, there's another one in the fire. Right? There's another one in the fire. And so he begins to kind of walk through this idea, and we're trying to ask the question, when it looks like grit, when it comes to our grit, our spiritual grit, obviously for these guys to stand up to a king, they had to have a decent amount of spiritual grit. But we said that on top of their ability to have spiritual grit, they had something special about it. And so we said, hey, it boils down to one word: integrity. That integrity is not only what you do in the dark when no one's watching. Integrity is also what you do when you have everything to lose, right? When every single thing that matters to you is on the line in your life, and you have 2 choices, one to do it God's way, one to do it the way that secures everything that you value, and you decide to do it God's way, that's integrity. When everything is on the line, what you decide to do in that moment, that also shows us your integrity. And so those 3 decide, hey, I'm willing to give up everything. In fact, they tell the king, hey, I don't even have to defend myself in this manner to you. Here, I don't have to defend myself. I don't want to argue with you about this. The music can play all day. We're not bowing down because we're obedient to God. So you do you. We're going to do us. We've already decided. We are whole on this. We are not divided. And so throw us in a furnace. That's what you got to do. That's what he does. They survive. We find another one in the fire we think it's Jesus. Doesn't specifically say Jesus, but Nebuchadnezzar looks like a son of the gods, right? And we say, man, he's so close. Just get rid of the S and put a capital G, and he's there. He looks like son of God, right? That this guy walking around, this guy sent from God for sure, sent from God, walking around the fire with them. And so we kind of broke it down into, hey, at the end of the day, we have this spiritual grit. But if we can take a little bit of integrity sauce and just put it all over that grit, it immediately increases it. You know, we have our spiritual grit score, put some integrity on top of it, and suddenly it kind of rises to the occasion. So now Nebuchadnezzar, that's the king, he realizes, hey, these 3 have something incredibly special about them, right? Incredibly special about them. But it doesn't change the way Nebuchadnezzar lives. In fact, we pick up at this really odd place in Nebuchadnezzar's life later on in his kingship and his reign, and he has kind of this crisis where he has this mental breakdown. And this mental breakdown eventually leads him out in the fields on his like hands and knees eating grass, is what the Bible tells us. Like, he has this breakdown and he ends up in the field eating grass like an ox or like an animal, right? That's what he's doing. So it's like losing everything. He's out there for a time. And God uses this time of this mental breakdown to kind of show him, hey, you should probably pay a little more attention to this Yahweh God that those 3 went in the fire for, that 4th guy standing in there with them. You should probably pay a little more attention. And so we get this response after that mental breakdown is finished. Nebuchadnezzar comes back and he says this in Daniel 4, Chapter 4:37, he says this, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." And so Nebuchadnezzar's making this admission. He says, hey, I thought I was the bomb shizzle, right? I thought I was the end-all, be-all. I thought I was the greatest guy on the planet. And I ended up on my hands and knees eating grass with the cows because I had this mental breakdown. And so at the end of the day, I'm going to recognize that God really is much better than I am. That everything he does is right. That's a huge change. An enormous change. From, hey, you do what I do. I build things, you bow down to it. I play music, you bow down to it. When I say something, you respond. When I say jump, you say how high. He was just gloating this entire thing. And I love what he says at the end. He says, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. It's like he's having this self-admission moment of, I had just gotten to a place in my life where I just thought I was untouchable. And then God humbled me. And he's all the better for it. So we have the spiritual grit score. It's increased by spiritual disciplines. We put the integrity sauce on it. Nebuchadnezzar has this moment of this mental breakdown, comes out of the mental breakdown with, I've been humbled by God and willing to acknowledge that he's the end-all, be-all. And now we're going to fast forward 30 years to something fairly incredible. Nebuchadnezzar is gone. It's 30 years later. Let me tell you the succession plan that has happened since then. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC. He ruled for 43 years. He was succeeded by a son who only ruled for 2 years, 562 to 560, right? His son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, was murdered in August 560 BC by his own sister's husband, so his brother-in-law. So his son also had a sister, married, killed this guy, so I guess she could be queen, he could be king. I'm not sure how that works, but that's what happened, right? So brother-in-law then ruled for 4 years, and then he was succeeded by his son, who only ruled for 2 months. So there's a lot of change in hands. Like Nebuchadnezzar, 40-something years, and then all of a sudden you got a bunch of people just killing folks, assassinating folks, having kids, dying prematurely, all these things. Well, then that guy, he ruled for 2 months, May and June of 556 BC. And then he was assassinated by another guy named Nabonidus. Nabonidus reigned for 17 years, and he had a son named Belshazzar. Well, while Nabonidus was out, he would go out on these long religious trips, and while he was gone from the king, he would make his king stand in as regent, or as king while he was gone, right? So he would officially be king while his father was gone. That's what's happened. I know it's a lot of change in hands, but that's where we're at, and this is where it picks up. And more specifically, we're going to get, so if you're a history nerd, you're about to like geek out with me. If you're not, you're like, can this be over? Let's go stand in the rain. I got you. We're coming, right? We're coming. The evening, and this is how we know, the evening, October 11th, 539 BC. The cool thing about this is that history records these events, but they don't have the inside scoop of what happens. Like history records what we're about to tell you, but they record it from the outside looking in. Because they're in the city of Babylon, modern-day Iraq, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the big wonders of the world, right? Like that's where we're at. And so the history books and people that have nothing to do with Jesus record what happens tonight, but they don't record what happens inside the room. They just record what happens on the outside of the walls and then inside of the walls. But we get a look inside the room. It's pretty cool. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just cool to me. I don't know. Here we go. We'll find out. Babylon was impenetrable. 2 sets of double walls for miles. 17 miles in length were the outer walls. 25 feet wide, over 40 feet tall. And so this group is coming to take Babylon, but everyone inside of Babylon knows there's no chance they're getting in. No one has systems to get over our walls or through our walls. We're safe. In fact, Babylon was so incredibly large, it had a river that ran straight through it, like an enormous river, like a legit river. And because it had a river that went straight for it, they were supplied already for up to 20 years for a siege, right? Life expectancy back then wasn't all that long. So it was like, look, if you want to spend your time waiting us out for the next 20 years, that's fine. Have at it. But, I mean, you're just going to hang out outside the walls. We have everything we need inside of our city, right? And so that's what's happening. The people are laying siege to the walls, and the people inside are like, well, this is fine. I've got no issue. You do what you do on the outside of the walls, this is fine. In fact, we pick up with Belshazzar, his dad is gone. And history tells us his dad actually fell 2 days prior, but he doesn't know this yet. So his dad was in another city. They took that city. He has no idea this has happened, so his dad's gone. But his dad is gone. He's the king. There's 1,000 people that he's gathered together for this ballroom, this get-together. And we're going to pick up in Daniel 5:2. It says this. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Let me pause. I know I just got done telling you this long succession line, and now it calls him his father. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was just the most famous relative it has, so they just jumped up to his father. It's not really his father. It's just that's who he's pointing to, right? So gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So if you weren't here week 1, let me just tell you, the way this whole thing started was that people of Jerusalem had a temple. In the temple, they worshiped God, Yahweh God. When Babylon came to take their city and destroy everything, they took some of the most precious and sacred articles from the temple where they would worship, and they took them and they put them in false gods' temples. So now we fast forward decades later. Those cups and those plates are still in this false god's temple. And so Belshazzar decides, hey, you know what? This is such a great night. There's an army outside my city, but they're never getting in. I've got 1,000 people here for a party. Let me just show you how great I am. Go get that stuff my great-great-granddad got from that temple of the Jews. Bring them in because I want to drink from where the places that the gods would drink from. Bring them to me. That's what Belshazzar decides to do, right? So this wasn't the plan at the beginning. Like at the beginning of the night, usually when you throw a party for 1,000 people and there are a bunch of royal folks and a bunch of high-end guests, you would plan ahead of time. What's the place setting going to be? What kind of food are we going to have? All those things were done. This was a last minute, I'm already in the middle of the party. By the way, go get those fancy cups. I want to drink from them. Which means, follow me here, he was probably intoxicated. Right? He drank a few too many. You know? This wasn't the plan when they started the evening out. All of a sudden, he comes to this place where he makes this decision, and this decision is about to mess things up for him, right? Here's our real-world lesson in this, right? Here's our real-world lesson. Someone else in that room knew that was a bad idea and didn't say anything. Like somebody else is sitting at the table with him. And when he says, hey, I'm snapping. Bring me the gold and silver from the God place, you know? When he says that, somebody else is probably thinking, you shouldn't do that, buddy. That's a bad idea. But nobody says anything. Why? Because he would have killed them. If somebody in that moment had stood up to him and said, hey, bro, that's a bad idea, everybody off with his head, right? Off with his head. So the real world lesson, how approachable are you when you're doing something questionable? How approachable are you when you're doing something questionable? Do you have someone in your life that you allow to come to you and say, hey, this isn't a good idea. You should stop. Or is everyone in your life afraid that you'll just say, off with his head? Do you allow yourself to be approached when you've made a mistake? I don't think we can skip over this part without us internalizing this just a little bit. And I don't want to stay on it too long. In fact, we're about to move, so if you're really uncomfortable and like your spouse is sitting next to you, like yeah, you listening? You know, like if that's happening right now, we're about to move on, but I just want to let it sit just for another minute, right? How approachable are you? And maybe you need to give a little permission. Maybe you need to give her permission. And like this afternoon, you need to turn to him and say, hey, you know, when I get really angry, I'm probably not very approachable, but I still want you to approach me. Even when I don't seem approachable, I want you to approach me. And you can say it when you're calm, and that way when it happens, you're like, but remember? And you're like, don't you but remember me. Because I remember and I know it's about to happen. And like, okay, well, as long as you're aware, I'm just exercising what you told me to do. So now we're good. I've approached you. Let's see if you're right or not, you know? Do you have someone that you trust that can shoot straight with you? That's a really good question to ask. So they're drinking from the goblets. When I say goblet, we're in this Harry Potter thing. I don't know if y'all don't like Harry Potter, but I'm a pastor. My kids listen to it, so I don't know what that makes me. But we're in this Harry Potter. There's this goblet of fire. Every time I see the word goblet, I think Harry Potter. So I don't know why I just share that with you. But they're drinking from the goblets. They're drinking from the goblets, and they're kind of doing their thing. And then this happens. Daniel 4, 5, and 6. It says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale and was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. And so they bring in these special goblets from the little temple that they were taken decades earlier by his great-grandfather and brought over from the temple of God. And he brings them in and they start just drinking from them and they're having a good old time and they're doing cheers and toasts and man, they're just throwing back. And all of a sudden he looks over and on the plaster wall where the biggest lampstand is, he starts seeing a human hand like what's the Addams Family hand? I should look this up. Thing, is that what his name is? You know what I'm talking about. He's writing on the wall. Just a human hand is writing on the wall. Just writing on the wall. And he's terrified. That's good. This is the best thing he's done all night, right? He's terrified. He's looking at the hand right on the wall. And his knees begin to shake. What would it be like for God to write on our wall? I don't know. You know when you're growing up, when things happen, you're like, oh, this is good, or no, this was bad. Right? Those kind of things. Like, for instance, my grandfather, he had this name for me, and it was Clintock. None of y'all start calling me Clintock. But that's what he would call me. If it was good, if I was doing good, he'd say, Clintock, come on, let's go. Clintock, let's do this right here, right? However, when my full name is Clinton, like Clinton, and so if my grandmother or my grandfather said Clinton James, and it wasn't just Clint James, it was Clinton James. I'm similar to y'all, I'm sure. When that came out of their mouths, I knew I prefer Clintock. Can we change it to Clinton? Because Clintock, you love me. Clinton James, you're mad at me, you know? And so that's what's happening. When he starts to write on the wall, I think immediately he knows this isn't a Clintock moment. This is a Clinton James moment. When the handwriting comes on the wall, I've got to do something differently now. You know, like this is a wake-up call. This isn't a warning. Something bad is happening in this moment. Something has to change. Was it too late? Was it too late? In the physical world, is there such a thing as it being too late? Yeah. Yeah, we do things all the time. And once we've made that decision, we've set in motion a series of events that we can't take back or undo. There are consequences in the physical world to our decisions constantly. And it's a difficult world to wrestle in because as followers of Jesus, we have to be in a place as parents or in relationships and marriage where we extend grace to someone, but then there are still those actual consequences that still have to kind of go through the motion and then kind of be kind of walked through or walked out, right? Like we extend grace, we forgive, but then there's still consequences. You can't stop the consequences from coming. Right? You can't stop them. And so in grace and in forgiveness, you walk beside them through the mess that they've created for themselves. This handwriting on the wall is an example of that, where there are now things that have been set in motion, and there's nothing he could do to stop it. That's just the real world. That doesn't make Jesus any less of a God because he doesn't stop the physical consequences that are results of our physical actions. That doesn't make him not a real God. What would disqualify him as a real God is if he failed to extend grace to you and then failed to walk with you through your negative consequences. But he's willing to do that. And so are many followers of Jesus. Because we attempt to be like Jesus ourselves as very best we can. So that when you make a mistake, sometimes it's difficult for us to realize there's got to be forgiveness and grace there, but then we want to walk with you through those consequences. We want to be there for you. We've had a number of people go into rehab. They made really terrible decisions. You can't stop the court order that comes with it, but instead you come alongside of them and you walk with them through that process. And it's a long and a messy process, but you walk with them and through them with that. Unfortunately, in this particular instance, the consequence is going to come so fast, there's not much time for walking. You see, no one knows what the hand has written on the wall. They can read it because it's in a language they're familiar with, but they don't understand it. They're like, but what does it mean? It's just a bunch of words just jumbled together. And so then his mother walks in. Belshazzar's mom walks in, and she says this: "There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." And so he says, hey, I brought all these people in with this supernatural knowledge, according to them. They look into the stars, and they can't tell me what this phrase on the wall means. And so his mom walks in, legitimate, or specifically it says the Queen Mother walks in. Queen Mother walks in and says, hey, if you go back far enough, I can actually tell you there's a guy inside of our kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar used for issues just like this. She's talking about Daniel. And so Daniel now, decades later, Daniel's still living an extraordinary life that still points to God. He's created a reputation in the midst of exile, away from his home, where everyone else still sees that there's something significant about him. They haven't quite figured out the God that he's pointing to, but they know for sure that there's something special that's happening inside of him. And I ask the question, what keeps Daniel so faithful in the land of exile? What keeps Daniel so faithful in the land of exile? Do you ever feel like you're in a land of exile? Like where you're not where home would be? You're not where you feel like you're perfect, like this perfect fit, and everything is exactly the way God wants it to be. That you've been taken, probably, most likely not by your choice, to a different season of life. Now, I'm not talking about a physical location. It could just be a mental thing. It could just be a season of life of stress. And you're just like, you know what? I just feel like mentally or spiritually, or maybe it could be even physically, like location-wise, geographically, that I'm just not in the place where God wants, or God gave birth to me. I'm just not in that place. Like, I just feel like I'm in exile. I think that's very relatable to us. And so we have to ask that question then. So how did Daniel stay so faithful in exile? I think the first conclusion we can come away with is that there must be more to our relationship with God than religion. I think that's really important. We're going to leave that on the screen for a second. There has to be something more to our relationship with God than religion. If you think about what exile is, especially for someone who is Jewish and in the temple system, the temple is where life and religious life and just life in general revolved around. But that was taken from Daniel. For multiple decades now, Daniel has been without what we would call our church. He hasn't been allowed to do church. He hasn't been allowed to go and worship with a ton of other believers, to do all those things. There hasn't been a central location where he could set it up and make those kind of things. As a Jew, there were sacrifices and festivals and all these things that he couldn't celebrate with his home people, right? And so without the religion piece of it, Daniel still found a way to remain faithful in the midst of exile, without the religious ceremony. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there anything more to our relationship with God than simply our religion? Or is the only time we connect with him is when we come into this place, or maybe it's another place, and the lights are down and the music is up, and suddenly I feel like, man, maybe God is here. And maybe that's the only time. If that's the only time, well, there's a good chance that at some point this could disappear. And then what would you have? What would you have? There must be more to our relationship with God than our religion. It can't be a series of tasks that we check off the box and simply move through week after week. There's something for us to learn here. Sometimes I wonder how incredible people like Daniel could have been, or how they could have turned out if they were put in their sweet spot. You know, I'm thinking to myself, but Daniel was like incredible, like one of the greatest guys in the Old Testament. But what if they had just left him at home? How much more incredible could he have been? Like if he was just right there in his homeland with all the people that knew him and to be able to stretch and use his gifts in the temple and around the temple and use his connection with God to connect more people and all those. What if Daniel was left at home? Chances are we wouldn't know Daniel. Let that sink in for a second. Maybe it's because of their circumstances we're able to see just how great he was. Have you ever considered that? Have you ever considered that it's your circumstances that are allowing you to put to work exactly what God has called you to do? Have you ever thought that the circumstances you are currently in are what God is going to use to make the biggest and best chapter of your life? I'm sure if Daniel wrote it from the beginning, exile would not be in any of his story. I'm sure if Daniel wrote it from the beginning, the 90-foot high and the 9-foot wide and the furnace, none of that is a part of his friend's story. I'm sure if Daniel wrote it from the beginning, he's not getting drug out of bed at 2 a.m. to go look at handwriting on the wall for some guy that just desecrated his holy God's treasures from his temple. Daniel probably hadn't even been close to those cups in 40, 50 years. And suddenly he's in the same room, but people who don't even recognize Yahweh are drinking from them. And they've called him out of bed to read the handwriting on the wall. Man, that's faithfulness. Maybe our circumstances have so much to do with who we become. In a good way. In a good way. I get it. There are some circumstances that are incredibly difficult. And in the midst of those circumstances, it can be really difficult to figure out which way to go. Here's the thing. It might take you some time. It might take a little bit of digging, but let me tell you this. Our circumstances always give us the choice to be God-honoring. Always. There's never a moment in your life where you are put in a circumstance where you can't figure out a way to bring God honor. Now, it might cost you. It might cost you a good bit. But there is always a way to bring honor to God. There's always a way to do the right thing. Because at the end of the day, you can put Jesus in any situation we're in, and he would be able to make a decision. And at the end of the day, that decision would be perfect. And so it's our job to take enough time to say, God, I'm in like a rock in a hard place, and I just don't see a way out. But how do I still remain faithful? We continue. Daniel sets the stage with a history lesson as he enters the room. He says, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. He says, hey, here's the deal. I know you don't know my God, but let me just fill you in. This dad you keep referencing, who's a few generations behind you, actually my God is the God that gave him everything that was great. I just want to remind you, let me begin my negotiation with just a reminder. Here's a history lesson. And then he continues. He says, but when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. And so Daniel says, hey, I want you to remember, Nebuchadnezzar was given everything he's got by my God. And when he got a little proud, when he got a little arrogant, when he got a little, I'm too much to handle, God took it from him and he ate grass. Don't forget. Just giving you a history lesson. You see, in this moment, we start to see this last little piece that's missing from our grit. Yeah, we've got spiritual grit that's fueled by spiritual discipline, that's covered with integrity. And then we have this last little piece that begins to unveil itself, beginning with what happens with Nebuchadnezzar, and it's starting to rear its head now, generations into the future. And it's simply this one small word called humility. Humility. Humility is a reoccurring theme for Jesus. Jesus said this, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. And Jesus said, watch me. I'm going to wash the feet of the people that I care about most. one of the church planters, Paul, says that Jesus humbled himself and he took on the very nature of a servant. And so humility and service were things that characterized Jesus. Jesus even said himself in Matthew 23:12, he says, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." This reoccurring theme of Jesus over and over and over again. I had a professor in college, he said, if you could describe Jesus with 2 words, he asked the whole class, he said, what would you do? And man, people were just giving out all kind of things, and love was the easy one, right? Love was the easy one, and then it was like, you can fill in the blanks. You probably have minds in your own, like, I know what it was. He said 2 words describe the entire ministry and person of Jesus, love and what? Humility. Humility. Son of God and Lamb of God takes away the sin of the world. King of kings, washing feet. An entire throne room and legions of angels. He loses people in his family, needs time to grieve, but sees a crowd and has compassion on them. Humility. We have spiritual grit. Our spiritual grit score increases with spiritual discipline. We cover that with integrity. And the final missing ingredient, humility. And that is what Daniel is attempting to teach Belshazzar and generations to come. You see, unfortunately for us, humility matters more than we likely want it to. And that's difficult for us to swallow. Humility for us matters more than likely we want it to. But it mattered so much to Jesus. Where are we humble? You see, it's just the opposite for Belshazzar. Daniel continues, he says, "But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this." He says, hey, you were completely aware with what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. "Instead," verse 23, "you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven." He said, it's worse because you already knew it. And because you already knew it, you still set yourself up against God. You still did it. So arrogance and pride, these things that put us at odds with God, that set us up against God, why is that such a big deal? Why does God not allow us to have, a little bit of time in the sun? Why does that aggravate God a little bit? I think it's simple. It's because before he created the world, he decided that one constant in his interaction with us would be that he would be our provider. He would be our source. He would be the source of our provision, our strength, our peace. And when we have a source for something, we recognize the greatness from which that source is. And so if all of a sudden we have created ourselves as the source of fill in the blank, when we become the person that creates that, God says, hey, you're taking my place. And so you might not be bowing down to a 90-foot tall, 9-foot wide golden statue, but when you look in the mirror every day, you are bowing down to yourself because you said, I am the source. And God says, no, that's my role, that's my job, and I don't want to freely give that up to you or anyone else. That's my role in your life. I'm your source. So don't try to take it. Arrogance puts us in God's place. That sets us up against him. And so now we get to see behind the curtain on that historic night. Daniel 5:25 says this. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. It means this. He looks at Belshazzar and says, God has numbered the days of your reign, and he's now brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And just those 4 little words, he says, let me tell you exactly what's about to happen. God has taken a look at your life. I think the one that stands out for me is you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. In other words, there's this idea already that God has said, this is what I would require of someone who's going to be a king. And he's put in the scales this idea of this is what it's going to be. And whoever he puts over here should be more than that or at least equal to. But when he put Belshazzar on the thing, it just slammed to the floor because he said, you don't measure up to what I require. He says, he put your life on the scales and you don't weigh enough. The things in your life haven't accumulated to what I want from someone who's going to be a king. He says, so your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. We know what happened that night. The armies that were surrounding the city, they dug a ditch and diverted water from that river. And slowly water ran and created a new marsh. And when the water level went low enough to about thigh height, they marched in through the river and nobody knew they were coming. They had just stopped watching the walls. What's the point? They can't get over them and they can't get through them. And surely they can't dig under them. But instead they dug just a little tributary, just a little ditch. Began to divert water on both the front and the back, the entry point and the back end where it exited. And then the army marched in. History tells us that the Babylonian Empire fell that night, and it fell without a battle. There was no fight because they weren't ready. All of their leaders were drinking out of cups from Yahweh, from a temple that had been ransacked decades before. They were drunk off their mind, sitting in the palace as they entered. They had no idea what was coming. Pride and arrogance. When it comes for us having spiritual grit, it requires spiritual discipline, it requires integrity, but it also requires an ongoing state of humility. Because a state of humility allows us to recognize we haven't arrived yet. If we constantly put ourselves in a place where we can be humble, we constantly come back to God and say, hey, I want more. I want more of you, God, because I haven't arrived yet. And so you don't end up with everything that God has given you, wasting it away because you thought everything is taken care of and every I is dotted and T is crossed and everything is fine and we can just drink until the night ends. Like those things just don't happen with people who are pursuing a humble relationship with God. It's always, what do you have for me next? Early the morning of October 12th, 539 BC, history records the fall of Babylon. And we know why. So what for us? Ultimately, we have to ask the question, if we follow the formula found in the book of Daniel, what does that mean and what do we become? Simply put, we put it this way. We are becoming a people of spiritual disciplines, spiritual grit, integrity, and humility. And because of this, we're becoming like Jesus. When we talk about the Bible, we talk about it being Old Testament and New Testament. And the Old Testament simply leads us to how Jesus got here. Daniel is entrenched into the Old Testament. The New Testament talks about what Jesus has done since he's gotten here and the birth of the church, which is the section we're now in. Daniel sits in the Old Testament, and a lot of times we wonder, what can we learn about the way God interacted with his people before Jesus showed up? I think there is so much to be gained out of the book of Daniel. The simple idea of grit, spiritual grit, the spiritual discipline that's required to elevate that spiritual grit score, the integrity that comes with it, to be undivided, to be whole in our thought, and the humility that says, God, I'm never finished. I simply want to be more like you. Those are things to take and treasure and put in our heart and to begin to ask questions about.